Welcome to our program, Mideast Realities. I'm Mark Bruzonsky, and I'm your host for this program. Since my student days, about 20 years ago, I've been going back and forth to the Middle East. I've probably been there 150 times. Usually, these days, 1995, when we talk about the Middle East, we talk about the peace process. But of course, it was just a few years ago that there was a massive war in the Gulf. Iraq has been destroyed. There are still sanctions against Iraq. We hear about turmoil in Algeria. We hear about problems in Pakistan. We hear about explosions in Saudi Arabia. What we don't hear very much right now is about the arms race in the Middle East. What people don't hear very much is that even though there is what the politicians tell us to be a peace process, the government of Israel increased its military budget this year. What we don't hear about is that arms sales to the region have never been higher. What we don't hear a lot about is that the Americans are the ones who in fact sell most of the arms to the Middle East. And today's program, in a sense, is a very unpleasant subject, but nevertheless, our goal with Mideast Realities is to bring you the truths of the situation as best we can. And thus this week we're talking about the nuclear arms race in the Middle East, something that I think if one did a search in Lexis and Nexis and tried to see if many articles have been published in the American press in the past year or so, there probably hasn't been too much published about this. But by the end of this program, I think you'll understand why we've chosen to discuss this subject. We want to bring you some clips that we've collected, some people discussing the situation in the Middle East, why there's a nuclear arms race, what the nuclear arms race, the risks that are involved to the countries in the Middle East. And by the end of the program, we hope that you'll have an understanding that even though the politicians are always telling us that there is the peace process, underneath the peace process, certain historical realities continue, certain tensions, certain competition between nations, ongoing tensions between Israel and the Arab states. The region actually is in considerable turmoil, from the civil war in Algeria to the sanctions applied against Iraq, to the situation in the Gulf. The very region itself is actually boiling, actually in turmoil, and one of the reasons for the peace process is an attempt by the United States government and the authoritarian governments of the region to come to some kind of accommodation in which this nuclear arms race that we're going to be talking about can maybe be prevented. Let's go to the first clip we have. It's from a BBC documentary from a few years ago. After we show you the clip, I'll explain to you its significance.
It was, in journalistic terms, a major world scoop, a major newspaper scoop of international significance. This story was definitive in that it proved beyond doubt that Israel had a nuclear capability, but not only that, it proved it had a very sophisticated nuclear capability, not just a couple of bombs a year, but an assembly line of bombs using the most sophisticated and advanced nuclear technology. And the result of this story was to place Israel as the world's sixth nuclear power. As a result of what we got from Vanunu, it was now clear that Israel deserved to be up there alongside France, Britain, China as a major nuclear nation.
Israel has never admitted to possessing nuclear weapons.
Israel undertook upon herself not to be the first country to introduce atomic weapons in the Middle East. This was our policy, and this is our policy.
Now, of course, the Shimon Peres pictured in this clip, he was then the foreign minister. Now, because of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, this is the same Shimon Peres who's now the prime minister. And let's be honest about it, that's the purpose of this program. Shimon Peres is a master of double talk. We all know that Israel has nuclear weapons. We knew so before Mordechai Vanunu, which I want to tell you a bit about in a few moments. But the Israelis try very hard to use this double talk language, that they will not be the first ones to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, on the pretext that because they haven't used them or because they haven't pushed the final screw together, they don't actually have nuclear weapons. Of course, it's not true. The Israelis have hundreds of extremely sophisticated nuclear weapons, And that is the origins of the nuclear arms race in the Middle East. This goes back to the 60s and the 70s. Whatever the motives that the Israelis had at the time and the Americans had at the time in bringing nuclear weapons to the Middle East, it was the Israelis who have done so. Now, a number of Arab countries have begun to try to develop nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and there used to be talk of the Islamic bomb and Gaddafi's involvement with Pakistan. Many of us who are experts about the Middle East believe that the Gulf War and the destruction of Iraq was far less about Kuwait than it was about Iraqi military power and the Iraqi desire to build nuclear weapons and other weapons, chemical, biological weapons of mass destruction. So in that sense, the arms race has already been going on, the nuclear arms race, but it's been going on at a relatively quiet level, and of course the politicians want to talk about other things. They don't want this subject to be put forward in people's minds. But let's also talk about Mordechai Vanunu, because the clip you just saw is from a documentary made by the BBC. I believe it was made about 4 years ago. There is a person languishing in a cell 7 by 10 feet in solitary confinement, imprisoned for 18 years in solitary confinement. And what was his crime? His crime was that he went to London and he told the London Sunday Times, not for money, not for personal gain, but for reasons of conscience, about Israel's nuclear weapons program. The London Sunday Times then published in 1986 this huge expose about nuclear weapons in the Middle East and Israel's nuclear arsenal. Vanunu was kidnapped. We've done other programs about Vanunu. Vanunu was kidnapped. He was brought to Israel. He was secretly put on trial. He languishes now in solitary confinement. And why does he do so? He does so because nuclear weapons are the secret of today's Middle East. Let's go to our next clip. It's from Cairo. It's a gentleman I've known for almost 20 years, one of the more profound and thoughtful commentators about the events of the Middle East. In fact, this gentleman wrote a book in 1973 called When the Guns Fall Silent, predicting that there would be an Arab-Israeli peace, although not the kind that's come about, which he's not very pleased about. But his name is Mohammed Saad Ahmed. I interviewed him in Cairo on the rooftop garden of the Carlton Hotel. Let's hear what he has to say about this subject. Nuclear arms race underway in the Middle East, even though it's not much talked about?
Yes, I think that if Israel is going to stick to the stand it has, there will be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Because it will not be as easy as before for Iraq to do what it did with Iraq when it hit Iraq's nuclear installations about 10 years ago. It is not, or 13 and 14 years ago. It is no longer as easy as it was before. And therefore, if Israel is going to stick to the idea that our nuclear weaponry is not to be touched, that is an invitation to the area to turn nuclear within the 10 or 15 coming years.
I'm going to repeat what we just said because the ramifications for the future seem to me extremely grave, and we've just sort of glanced over it as if it's one more part of the discussion. There is a nuclear arms race in the Middle East today. That's what you're saying.
There will be if Israel does not pull back on its monopoly over nuclear weapons.
And do you really think the Israelis intend to pull back?
If they do not pull back, it will be a nuclear arms
What
race.
do you think? You've been living in this region all your life.
I don't expect them to pull back on this issue. I don't expect them to pull back, or at least the most they would do is to promise, given certain conditions, that they would eventually consider the issue later on, and this is not satisfactory for them.
I mean, it's a little bit like the peace. The Israelis call what we have now peace. As you point out, it's surrender, it's not peace. People understand it's not peace. The Israelis say that they will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the region, but we all know they have nuclear weapons. We all know from published reports that they have hundreds of nuclear weapons.
Yes, of course. But no, they have. What I want to say is it has become very difficult today to indefinitely keep out of the region a nuclear build-up if one state believes that it can keep its monopoly over these weapons.
And are you suggesting, even though you haven't said, that even moderate pro-American states, pro-peace process states like Saudi Arabia and Egypt will be propelled in the direction of weapons of mass destruction?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is frightening, you realize what you're saying.
I know. I don't think that anybody will accept Israel alone to have nuclear weapons in this area ever.
because the emotions of this region are not like the Cold War when the Cold War took place, there were two centers of authority. And the couple of times we got close to a nuclear war, those centers of authority pulled back. The passions of this part of the world, with competing centers of authority and competing emotions.
The threat is there.
The threat is...
That's what you're talking about.
Well, that's what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. No, what I'm saying, I'm saying as I see it. I mean, put all together, it will begin today by Israel having the nuclear weaponry and the Arabs not having. Then there will be signs that Israel cannot see peace. Today, what Israel and America are saying, there cannot be peace and terrorism. Tomorrow it will be, we cannot have peace and military regimes in the Arab world, or regimes issued out of the military in the Arab world. So that will be antagonizing many parties who so far are ready even to make a peace deal with Israel. Then lower down the road we'll have one party nuclear and others not. All these factors can only contribute to create a situation where the rules of the game as they are presented now in the name of peace have no future.
This discussion with Mohammed Said Ahmed took place the last time I was in Egypt, which was May of 1995. Mohammed is one of the leading commentators in the Arab world. He writes for Al Ahram, the leading newspaper, the New York Times of Egypt. He has been published throughout the world. He's been in this country repeatedly lecturing. He's an establishment critic, if you like. And I have to admit, I was a bit unprepared for the discussion of nuclear weapons when we sat down to discuss the peace process back in May. And the fact that I was unprepared for it is an example of how easy it is for all of us to get distracted by current headlines, to get distracted by White House ceremonies with Yasser Arafat and Rabin and Peres, to get distracted by headlines that talk about peace process, and not to look further, more deeply, underneath the headlines to what's really taking place in the region, to what's really going on among the peoples and the countries of the region. And the realities are that armaments in the Middle East have never been at a higher level, that the amount of money being spent on them has never been more, that the amount of arms the United States sells on a yearly basis has never been more. And what's really taking place in the Middle East is not so much a new world order as a new world domination. What's really taking place is American restructuring of the region in an attempt to dominate the region. Of course, Israel, being America's primary ally, a country of less than 5 million Jews, is the sub-dominator of 23 Arab countries and 200 plus million Arabs. Under these circumstances, even a person as establishment and as sophisticated as Mohammed feels the need to discuss the nuclear arms race. And as you heard him say, his belief is that Israel will not pull back, that Israel will attempt to remain the sole nuclear power in the region. And that, of course, creates the conditions where even states that are working with the Americans, even client regimes in countries like Egypt and the Gulf, feel a need and feel pressure coming from their military and coming from public opinion to develop counter weapons of mass destruction. Not to mention what happens in states which have revolutions, like Iran, which clearly has a nuclear weapons program, like Algeria, like the Sudan. Let's take you to another clip, this one outside the Israeli embassy, a demonstration that took place in September of 1995. After the clip, I'll again mention to you why I think it's so significant.
Nomi, and we're here to call for the release of Mordecai Vanunu and to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons in the Middle East and around the world. And I just heard on the news this morning, James Baker had a press conference yesterday and announced that during the Gulf War, had Iraq used chemical or biological weapons, that George Bush had made a decision to use nuclear weapons. So if anyone here has any illusions about the importance of our work and that our work is not far from over, this is just another example of the continuing real political use of nuclear weapons by threatening to use them. That in a sense is a real use of nuclear weapons, and and we need to be aware of that.
Well, here, of course, is the ultimate contradiction. The United States, the other Western powers, possess nuclear weapons. At the same time, they insist that other states are not allowed to possess or develop nuclear weapons. When Pakistan attempts to develop weapons, we pass all kinds of restrictions, embargoes. When Iraq attempted to develop nuclear weapons, the Israelis bombed it, and then, as I said previously, many of us believe Iraq was destroyed not because of the invasion of Kuwait, but because of the policies of strength and countervailing power that Iraq was pursuing. When you hear a story like this, the former Secretary of State telling us in his memoirs that he had personally threatened Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, that if the Iraqis used their chemical and biological weapons, the United States would respond with nuclear weapons. I don't believe he actually used the term nuclear weapons, but the meaning was very clear. George Bush, in that situation, even when there was no threat to the United States in terms of any threat to our own country, even when our military clearly outclassed the Iraqis, there was no question who was going to win that war. Nevertheless, the United States still threatened the use of nuclear weapons. Now, what does that do to the psyche of peoples in the Middle East who understand that their region has been balkanized, who understand that client regimes have been imposed on them, who understand that they live totally without democracy, totally without power? They live in police states, they live in tyrannies, they live in democracies where the votes mean little. They live in a situation where the Americans talk about democracy and self-determination, but in reality America imposes these client regimes on the peoples of the region. And then we haven't even gotten into economic issues of colonialism and imperialism. It's these kinds of factors, it's this kind of thinking, it's this kind of tension which creates in the region an understanding among the elite, among the Mohammed Sid Ahmeds of the region, that nuclear weapons and an arms race are going to be thrust on the region so long as Israel and the United States attempt to dominate through the possession of their own weapons of mass destruction. Now, nobody can clairvoyantly tell you how this is going to work out, and what years it's going to happen, and exactly what country is going to take what step. After all, it wasn't that long ago that the Shah of Iran was our closest ally in the region, and the Shah of Iran was wiped out within 6 months of his appearance at the White House and Jimmy Carter telling us how stable his country was. We have one final clip for you in this program. Another nuclear activist, his name is Sam Day. He's the chairperson of the Free Vanunu Committee. And let's go to that clip. And again, after, I'll try to put in perspective this whole subject.
Einstein, who said that with the unleashing of the power of the atom, everything changed except our way of thinking, and so we drift towards inevitable disaster. What he meant by that was that when we learn how to harness the power, nuclear power, we got control over forces that are so much beyond our ability to understand, that we're sort of like children playing with dynamite. We simply do not comprehend in our minds, let alone master in our political processes, this kind of destructive power. So that when we learn how to harness the power of the atomic bomb, and then use the atomic bomb as another form of weaponry, another form of diplomacy, we brought about a nuclear arms race which led us to where we are now. It's a little bit down in numbers from what it was at its height in the late 1980s, but we have still some 18 to 20,000 nuclear weapons, some of them more than 1,000 times more destructive than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, which was itself 1,000 times more destructive than any previous bomb. And yet we devise policies that contemplate the use or the threatened use of these weapons of mass destruction.
We live at this time in the post-Cold War world, in a world in which it looks as if, at least for the foreseeable future, the idea of a nuclear war between the superpowers isn't very likely. I can still remember being in the Soviet Union 13, 14 years ago, having dinner a few nights with people from the US and Canadian Institute. Reagan had just become president. The tensions were extreme. We were sitting there drinking vodka as intellectuals, none of whom had direct access to power, but all of us were on the periphery of the people who had power. And we actually were drinking vodka talking about the likelihood at the time of a nuclear war between our countries. Well, at the moment at least, that particular danger seems to be in recession, although the situation in the Soviet Union could change and things could go another direction. On the other hand, in the Middle East, the tensions of the region, the built-in conflicts to the region, the instabilities of the region, the internal chances of revolution and violence are such that the possibility of major warfare with weapons of mass destruction exists, and exists very seriously. The peace process that's so much in the news these days, if it were a real, stable, honest, just peace process, might change the balance of forces and might change the psychology of the situation. But there, in a sense, is the issue that we all have to deal with, and deal with much more honestly than we have. Because while the politicians are telling us that the peace process is a major accomplishment, the experts are telling us that the peace process is a sham, is unstable, is not likely to work. Let me just read you a couple of quotes to bring this program to a conclusion, because in the end, if the peace process isn't stable, if these experts are right in their thinking, then of course we're living through maybe the eye of the storm, and in the eye of the storm things are calm, but the storm is going to come back. Here's what Edward Said recently has said about the peace process, one of the leading Palestinian commentators in the world. I don't think it's wrong or any kind of exaggeration to say that Arafat and his Palestine Authority have become collaborators with the military occupation, a sort of Vichy government for Palestinians. With Oslo, the peace process entered a new and much more destructive phase. Far from bringing peace, it brought greater suffering for Palestinians, the main victims of this mess, and a much greater threat to the long-term interests of the Israeli people. Every leader involved with the Oslo process, Palestinian, Israeli, American, or European, has acted, in my opinion, without principles and without anything remotely resembling vision and truthfulness. Worse, large droves of intellectuals, scholars, and experts have, in my opinion, betrayed their vocations, to say nothing of their expertise and knowledge, and this betrayal has contributed to the amazingly compliant attitude of the American media in particular, who have celebrated, extolled, saluted, and rejoiced when there has been neither occasion nor cause to justify such excessive hand-clapping and jubilation. Edward Said, Columbia University, one of the major Palestinian intellectual personalities. Here's what Professor Bill Quandt has to say, speaking as the keynote speaker at the Middle East Institute conference. Middle East Institute, the heart of the political establishment in Washington. My early assessment makes me pessimistic about the next stage of the negotiations. It is not so much a matter of figuring out whether the proverbial glass is half empty or half full. It is more the growing conviction that this may well be the last negotiated agreement between Israelis and Palestinians for many years to come. Instead of building momentum for peace and inspiring mutual trust and confidence, this agreement could portend a long, dry, and possibly quite violent period ahead. Instead of living in peace alongside a viable Palestinian democratic state, it looks increasingly as if Israel will remain in control of much of the West Bank and Gaza. There are many other quotes on this sheet from Noam Chomsky, from Israel Shahak, from professors at Palestinian universities, from Mohammed Sid Ahmed in the discussion I had with him in Cairo. In fact, the more independent and the more expert one tends to be on the subject of the peace process, the more one tends to be cynical, pessimistic, dejected at the way the media is manipulated to present things the way the politicians want them presented, rather than the way they actually seem to be when you're in the Middle East, living with the people in the Middle East, feeling the tensions and pressures of the situation in the region. That's why we brought you this program. A nuclear arms race is underway in the Middle East. It's been stalled by the destruction of Iraq. It's been stalled by Benazir Bhutto's election in Pakistan. It's been stalled by the embargo that Libya has been placed under. There hasn't as yet been a revolution in Egypt. There hasn't as yet been a revolution in Saudi Arabia. But tune in next week, please. We'll try to tell you more about the situation in the Middle East. I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.